September 22, 1943, Kåfjord, northern Norway. The water is black, still, and mercilessly cold. Beneath a shroud of fog, the mountains rise like silent sentinels over a fjord, guarded by steel nets and armed patrol boats. The surface glimmers faintly under the northern moon, but deep below, something stirs. A shape no longer than a city bus, crawling forward in near silence. Inside, 4 British men sit in suffocating darkness, their faces pale beneath the dim glow of red lights. The air smells of oil and metal, thick with the weight of breath recycled too many times. Their vessel, an experimental midget submarine known only as X6, is inching toward the unthinkable. Above them, moored and monstrous, lies the German battleship Tirpitz, pride of the Kriegsmarine and terror of the Arctic convoys. Its massive shadow cuts through the cold depths, a floating fortress armed with 8 15-inch guns, hundreds of crew, and layers of defense. The X-craft's instruments tremble as it slips beneath her keel. One mistake here, and the fjord will become their grave. Yet they keep moving, not for glory, not for medals, but to prove that even a so-called toy submarine could cripple a giant. The operation that began as a desperate experiment has now entered its most silent hour, and history holds its breath. In the early years of the Second World War, the Atlantic was a battlefield without boundaries. Every ton of cargo sent from the United States and Canada to Britain was life itself: food, fuel, weapons, survival. To protect those lifelines, Allied convoys sailed through freezing seas, hunted relentlessly by U-boats and Luftwaffe bombers. But after the loss of the Bismarck in May 1941, Germany still had one last trump card: her sister ship, the Tirpitz. Displacing over 42,000 tons, bristling with armor and artillery, she was more fortress than vessel. To the British Admiralty, the Tirpitz was not just a battleship, it was a threat that paralyzed strategy. Her mere presence in the Norwegian fjords forced the Royal Navy to divert precious ships to guard convoys, consuming resources Britain could hardly spare. When the Tirpitz was completed in early 1941, she was sent north to Norway to command the Arctic. From there she could strike the convoys running from Scotland and Iceland to the Soviet ports of Murmansk and Archangel. Hitler himself had ordered it. The Tirpitz must never risk a direct confrontation like her doomed sister. She would be a fleet in being, a constant menace to keep the Allies guessing. It worked. Every time radar or reconnaissance hinted at the Tirpitz's movement, convoys were rerouted or delayed, costing days and lives. By 1942, British intelligence knew she was anchored in the remote Kåfjord near Alta, shielded by mountains and anti-aircraft batteries. The fjord was narrow, deep, and layered with defenses: torpedo nets, patrol boats, underwater mines. It was said that no ship could reach her, and no aircraft could strike her with precision in such terrain. The Royal Air Force tried, again and again. Between 1942 and early 1943, wave after wave of heavy bombers, Halifaxes, Lancasters, and Mosquitoes, flew missions against the Tirpitz. Each time weather, distance, and Norwegian geography defeated them. The bombs missed, and the ship endured, unscratched and unshaken. For the Admiralty, the humiliation was growing unbearable. The Tirpitz was not only untouchable, she was a symbol of German invincibility, a psychological weapon as powerful as her guns. If she ever sailed south to the Atlantic even briefly, the convoy routes could collapse. Britain could not afford to wait for that day. In 1943, the problem reached the desk of Admiral Sir Max Horton, commander of the Royal Navy's submarines. The solution, if it could be called that, seemed absurd. If large ships and aircraft could not reach the Tirpitz, perhaps something much smaller could, something that could slip through nets and mines, unseen and unheard. The idea had been brewing for months in the minds of a few engineers and submariners: the creation of a miniature submarine, crewed by only 4 men, capable of carrying explosive charges powerful enough to cripple a battleship. It was an idea that belonged more to invention than to warfare, but desperation often makes innovation inevitable. The first prototypes were crude: They looked more like mechanical coffins than submarines, barely 30 feet long, powered by small electric motors, and fitted with detachable explosive charges called side cargoes. These experimental vessels were officially named X-craft. The men who volunteered to test them knew what they were getting into. Long hours underwater, no space to stand, constant leaks, and the ever-present risk of carbon dioxide poisoning. But to the Royal Navy, these small submarines represented something priceless, a chance to strike a blow where no other weapon could reach. What began as an experiment in engineering was slowly becoming a weapon of precision sabotage. By mid-1943, the concept had matured into a plan. Operation Source, a covert mission to attack the Tirpitz and her sister ships in Norwegian waters, was approved. It would be one of the most daring underwater operations in history. From a Scottish base, 6 X-craft would be towed by full-size submarines across the North Sea, released near the Norwegian coast, and left to navigate through mines, nets, and patrols on their own. The target? The Tirpitz, Scharnhorst, and Lutzow, the heavyweights of Hitler's navy. It was a mission on which few expected to return. Yet for the Royal Navy, this was the only path left to silence the shadow that had haunted the Arctic convoys for over 2 years. And so, deep beneath the bureaucratic corridors of Whitehall and the concrete pens of Scotland, engineers and sailors worked side by side to prepare the smallest submarines ever built for the biggest target in the Atlantic. But invention alone would not be enough. The success of Operation Source would depend on human endurance, mechanical perfection, and a kind of courage that could survive in darkness, both literal and psychological. The time had come for the Royal Navy to trust its fate to machines that looked like toys, and to the men willing to pilot them into the heart of enemy waters. By the spring of 1943, the X-craft were no longer mere sketches on a drawing board but a small, hardened flotilla preparing for its first great test. Built at Vickers Armstrong in Barrow-in-Furness and barely 16 meters long, each X-craft was a cramped, awkward machine, a pressure hull barely wider than a man's shoulders, electric motor for silent running, and a crew originally of 3 that would operate as a 4 when a diver was added for demolition work. These boats were towed across open seas behind full-size submarines, carried by day in canvas cradles, and slipped free at night to continue the last, most dangerous miles under their own power. The concept, conceived and refined by engineers and submarine officers, including Commander Cromwell Varley, and pushed through by Flag Officer Submarines Max Horton, combined cutting-edge improvisation with grim practicality. If big weapons could not reach the German heavy ships in their fjord anchorages, perhaps something small and stealthy could. Training took place under strict secrecy at HMS Varbel on the Isle of Bute, a converted hydropathic hotel where crews learned to live in a world measured in inches and breaths. Men trained for hours submerged in locks, learning to navigate by dead reckoning, to listen for propeller tones, and to wrestle leaking valves at 2 in the morning when carbon dioxide boiled under the watch glass. Passage crews, who would take the X-craft under tow, handed over to operational crews close to the Norwegian coast, a dangerous crew change in black water and worse weather. Intelligence from the Norwegian resistance and reconnaissance flights narrowed the target to Kåfjord and the Tirpitz, but geography would not be negotiated. Fjords funneled attackers into straightforward approaches while offering defenders overlapping arcs of fire and anti-submarine protection. The training at Varbel was meant to make impossibilities routine. The plan that became Operation Source was precise and brutal in its simplicity. 6 X-craft, X5 through X10, would be towed by 6 conventional submarines across the North Sea and released within striking range of the Alta Kåfjord system. X5, X6, and X7 were assigned to the Tirpitz, X8 to the heavy cruiser Lutzow, X9 and X10 to the Scharnhorst. Each X-craft carried side charges designed to be detached and sink to the seabed beneath an enemy hull. Once triggered, the charges would make the ship effectively keelless for a time. Yet from the outset, the voyage itself would be perilous. On the passage north, X9 was lost with all hands when her tow parted, and she dived uncontrollably, and X-8 suffered leaks that forced her scuttling before the attack. These losses foreshadowed the razor-thin margin between daring and disaster on which the operation would rest. The mechanics of the X-craft were starkly ingenious. Small side-mounted demolition charges were engineered to become negatively buoyant when released. A copper strip peeled away. Seawater flooded a chamber and the charge sank to rest on the seabed beneath a ship's hull. Navigation was by compass, periscope sightings when possible, and coastal fixes relayed by brief contacts with shore reconnaissance. Everything else was driven by the men's sense of distance, time, and sound. Passage crews endured the tow. Operational crews then squeezed into the hull, sealed hatches, and began the slow, intolerable approach toward a target that was both guess and dread. The human element mattered as much as the machine. The X-craft could be repaired in a shed, but the will to crawl into the cold dark and face death under a steel giant could not be manufactured in a shipyard. Command and courage met in the mission's leaders. The towing submarines that carried the X-craft north included HMS Thrasher, Truculent, Stubborn, Sea Nymph, Certus, and Scepter, a silent convoy whose cargoes were living, breathing bombs. When the time came, operational commanders like Lieutenant Donald Cameron of X-6 and Lieutenant Godfrey Place of X-7 would guide their fragile boats beneath the hulking silhouette of the Tirpitz itself. Their actions would later earn Victoria Crosses and other decorations, but not before men were lost, boats were stranded, and 6 X-craft had disappeared into the night one way or another. The mission was not only a test of devices, it was a surgical attempt to remove the Tirpitz from the strategic chessboard, to give Allied convoys breathing room, and to deny the Kriegsmarine a weapon that had, by presence alone, forced the Royal Navy's hand for 2 years. By the time the flotilla reached Norwegian waters in September, the technical wrinkles had been ironed as far as possible, and the men had practiced until their reactions were instinctive. But the fjord would not be practiced for. It would be experienced in bone and pressure, and in the sudden shock of depth charges or gunfire. The X-craft that slipped free into the cold of Kåfjord did so knowing that, even if they succeeded in placing their charges, escape was uncertain. The operation therefore balanced on 3 pillars: engineering cleverness, relentless training, and a human capacity to accept a mission whose success might mean capture or death. From there, the story narrows: a handful of tiny submarines in a long, dark fjord, and a battleship whose shadow had edited Allied strategy for 2 years. The next section examines this story from the different human and tactical angles that made Operation Source both possible and unforgettable. The human angle begins with breath and bone. Inside an X-craft there was no space for private thoughts to sprawl. The hull measured only a few feet across, and every movement was economy. Men who volunteered for these boats were sailors conditioned to smallness. Engineers, stokers, petty officers used to tight compartments, but never to this compression of time and air. The operational crew, typically a commander, a pilot, a diver, and a mechanic, lived by routines so precise they became ritual. They slept in shifts of an hour or less, ate hard biscuits and tinned food taken in pauses between systems checks, and communicated in clipped, rehearsed phrases that could not be misunderstood when CO2 began to fog the lenses. Fear in such a place had a peculiar texture. It arrived slowly, in headaches and the metallic taste of stale air, and then became companionable, a constant knot around the chest that sharpened senses and shortened jokes. Yet camaraderie was no less real for the claustrophobia. Men who crawled into X-crafts did so trusting one another's hands on vents and valves, and the quiet confidence between pilot and diver often decided life or death long before charges were set. When the small boats crept beneath the Tirpitz, the human story was not a blaze of heroics, but a grinding sequence of tiny, exact acts, a valve turned at the right degree, a compass checked against a landmark, a breath held while the sea closed its teeth. Those acts, mundane on any other day, compounded into a moral geometry that made the mission possible. Ordinary men doing extraordinary work under conditions that would have broken most. The leadership angle is a study in institutional risk and imaginative audacity. The admiralty that greenlit Operation Source was not romantic. It was pragmatic to the point of cruelty. For 2 years, the Tirpitz had been a strategic albatross, forcing the Royal Navy to dilute strength and reassign modern units to patrols that should have been elsewhere. Authorizing midget submarines was a clear, cold calculation. If air and heavy fleet power could not dispossess the German battleship, then surgical low-profile sabotage offered the next best chance. Leaders like Admiral Sir Max Horton and the staff at the Admiralty had to weigh political consequences alongside tactical ones. Failure would mean not only loss of men and boats, but also the risk that Germany would gloat and Allied morale would suffer. That calculus produced an unorthodox command culture, one that tolerated unconventional ideas from engineers and junior officers, and that accepted high casualty probabilities in exchange for strategic gain. Commanders in the field held similar burdens. Towing captains had to thread their submarines through hostile seas, while knowing that if a tow parted, men might drown alone. Ex-craft commanders had to decide when to abort and when to press on, despite unknown damage. Leadership here was less about grand speeches and more about issuing calm, precise orders in the dark and trusting small teams to execute them. The engineering angle turns on elegant minimalism. The X-craft were masterpieces of constrained design. Short, sleek hulls built to minimize acoustic signature and present a tiny target to nets and patrols. Their electric motors produced barely a whisper when running on batteries. Their control systems prioritized reliability over complexity, because a broken gizmo in a fjord is a death sentence. The demolition charges they carried were not crude bombs, but carefully balanced devices designed to sit on the seabed, affixed to the hull indirectly, and detonate with maximum effect under the keel where armor was weakest in terms of suspension. The detachable side charges were engineered to flood and sink at a predictable rate, and to be triggered after a preset delay, a problem that demanded precise calculations of depth, current, and the time it would take an X-craft to clear the blast radius. Redundancies were few because weight and space were at a premium. Instead, reliability came from craftsmanship and from mastering the operating environment in training. Survival depended on valves that would not freeze, on seals that would hold under pressure, and on a diver's skill to fasten clever clamps against hulls, while watched by searchlights and listening posts. In short, the X-craft embodied a marriage of mechanical cunning and human skill. Small, almost toy-like machines that translated into strategic leverage, because their design solved a problem brute force could not. These angles, human, leadership, and engineering, capture parts of the story. But they do not yet tell the whole truth. Beneath them sits another set of perspectives: the German defenses and psychology, the moral weight on the men who volunteered, and the strategic ripple effects that followed. Shall I continue to on the enemy's side? The Tirpitz rested like a sleeping predator. She was moored beneath cliffs that shielded her from aerial observation, surrounded by nets and anchored mines, watched over by patrol boats and Luftwaffe reconnaissance squadrons. To the German Navy, this position in the Kåfjord seemed impregnable. Engineers had woven layers of anti-torpedo nets across the water, and hydrophones listened for any trace of an approaching submarine. Guards on deck were drilled to fire depth charges at the first hint of disturbance. The ship's captain, Hans Meyer, trusted his defenses completely. The Tirpitz had withstood air raids and sabotage attempts. She was a fortress afloat. Yet that very confidence bred a subtle blindness. German commanders believed that no human could navigate those underwater obstacles, that the Royal Navy had neither the technology nor the madness to send men into such a trap. It was a reasonable assumption, born of logic, and it would prove fatal. There was, too, a moral and psychological angle to this story. The men chosen for Operation Source were volunteers, but volunteer was an inadequate word for what they agreed to do. Each knew that success meant probable capture or death. The X-craft carried no escape hatches, no contingency plans. Once detected, a single depth charge could tear the hull apart in seconds. Yet these men accepted their task with a calm that bordered on fatalism. Their letters home, written before departure, often spoke not of glory but of necessity, of a sense that someone had to go, and that they were ready to be that someone. Inside their claustrophobic vessels, time lost meaning. The walls sweated, condensation dripped, and carbon dioxide levels climbed to near poisonous levels. Sleep came in fragments, and fear had to be compartmentalized like oxygen itself. The psychological resilience required to continue hour after hour in silence and darkness cannot be overstated. It was not courage in the cinematic sense, but endurance, the quiet defiance of men who refused to surrender even to their own terror. Finally, the strategic angle completes the picture. The destruction or even temporary crippling of the Tirpitz would transform the naval war in the North Atlantic. As long as the German battleship remained operational, every Arctic convoy had to be heavily escorted, and vast resources were diverted to counter a ship that rarely left its anchorage. Churchill himself called her the Beast, a constant weight upon the Allied command. Removing her, even for a few months, would free up destroyers, cruisers, and carriers for other theaters: the Mediterranean, the Pacific, and the coming invasion of France. Operation Source, then, was not an act of desperation but of strategy. It was a precise incision meant to bleed German naval power without requiring a grand fleet engagement. If successful, it would demonstrate that technological ingenuity and human will could outmaneuver even the strongest enemy position. From these perspectives, enemy overconfidence, moral endurance, and strategic foresight, the stage was set. The men were trained, the boats were ready, and the Tirpitz lay silent in her fjord, unaware that 6 tiny shadows were already crossing the cold depths toward her. The next moment in this story would decide whether Britain's gamble would become triumph or tragedy. Before dawn on September 22, 1943, the Arctic sky above Kåfjord was a slate of cloud and mist. Beneath it, the water seemed still, almost sacred in its silence. Yet below that surface, the most daring underwater assault of the war was already in motion. Towed across 1,000 miles of hostile sea, the surviving X-craft, X5, X6, and X7, were now operating alone. Each boat had been released from its mother submarine days earlier, the towing lines cut, and the men left to navigate the last, most dangerous stretch into enemy waters. Inside the claustrophobic hulls, exhaustion was layered upon exhaustion. Battery power was low, air foul, and minds blurred from days without proper rest. Every creak of the metal hull sounded like a death sentence. Yet they pressed forward, inch by inch, driven by training, instinct, and the unspoken, understanding that the fate of thousands of sailors in the Arctic convoys might rest on their success. Lieutenant Donald Cameron commanded X6. His craft had already suffered malfunctions: a defective periscope, a jammed gyro compass, and a leaking valve that forced constant manual pumping to keep the vessel afloat. Lieutenant Godfrey Place in X7 faced similar hardships, navigating through a labyrinth of currents and underwater cables that could snag or reveal them at any moment. They had memorized every contour of the fjord, but reality was different. The terrain beneath them was alive with hazards: rock ledges, silt clouds, shifting depths. Above, the Tirpitz's guards carried out routine patrols, unaware that, just meters below their feet, British submariners were crawling toward them through darkness. By mid-morning, the first of the German defenses appeared in the periscopes. Massive anti-submarine nets stretched across the fjord like spiderwebs of steel. Each layer was suspended from floats and anchored deep, forming an impenetrable barrier that no full-sized submarine could cross. But the X-craft were not full-sized. Using careful buoyancy control, the small vessels edged downward, scraping through narrow gaps, brushing metal cables that could have triggered alarms if touched too hard. It was a ballet of precision and terror. At one point, X6's battery shorted under the pressure. Sparks flickered in the cabin, and the men had to work blind, sweating in silence as their craft drifted dangerously close to the nets. When power returned, Cameron decided they could not turn back. He ordered ballast tanks adjusted, and the little submarine slid under the last layer of defense, directly beneath the Tirpitz. The world above was colossal. Through the thin hull and hydrophone hum, the crew could hear the rhythmic pounding of engines and generators aboard the German ship. The Tirpitz loomed like a mountain of metal, her hull descending deep into the blackness. Cameron maneuvered carefully, rising just enough to graze the underbelly of the beast. At that moment, they were less than 10 meters below the enemy's keel. The plan was simple but suicidal. Attach the 2 explosive side charges, each containing 2 tons of amatol, to the seabed directly beneath the ship. They would then retreat, detonate the fuses, and, if luck held, escape the blast radius before capture or destruction. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Place in X-7 was fighting his own battle against physics. A collision with an underwater cable had damaged his periscope, leaving him nearly blind. Navigating by feel and sonar, he relied on depth readings and sound echoes to trace the Tirpitz's position. Each adjustment had to be guessed. Each wrong move could bring the submarine crashing into the fjord floor or rising into detection range. Yet Place, too, found his mark. After hours of crawling beneath the German ship, he positioned his X-craft beneath the engine room and began releasing the side charges. The timing had to be precise. 7-hour fuses, synchronized with X-6s. Any delay would mean overlapping explosions or premature discovery. At 7 a.m., fate began to close in. A lookout on the Tirpitz spotted a small periscope wake near the hull. The alarm blared. Depth charges were dropped blindly, their explosions reverberating through the fjord. Inside X6, lights flickered. Inside X7, pipes cracked. The shockwaves slammed into the submarines like hammer blows. Still, the British crews stayed silent, fingers steady on their controls, hearts pounding in rhythm with the explosions. They were beneath the very guns that had dominated the Arctic, invisible yet deadly. The charges were armed. The fuses burned quietly in the dark water. There was no turning back now. The clock began its final countdown. 7 hours until the explosions that would either cripple Germany's greatest battleship or bury the attackers forever. The men in the X-craft could do nothing more. They had become passengers of their own courage, trapped beneath the shadow of the Tirpitz, waiting for history to decide what would surface: triumph or silence. The alarms aboard the Tirpitz had thrown the entire fjord into chaos. Sirens echoed off the cliffs as sailors scrambled to battle stations. Searchlights swept across the water, slicing through mist and fog in long, frantic arcs. Patrol boats roared to life, their engines thrumming through the narrow channel. Below, the British submariners fought to stay composed amid the fury they had unleashed. Lieutenant Donald Cameron in X6 knew their presence was now certain. Depth charges exploded nearby, shaking the vessel violently, throwing tools and instruments against the steel walls. Seawater began to seep through cracked seals, and the air inside turned thick and metallic. Cameron looked at his crew, men he had trained with for months, and simply nodded. There was no time for words. He guided X6 into position one final time, aligning her precisely beneath the Tirpitz's midsection, then released both side charges. They sank silently to the seabed, locking into place under the German ship's massive frame. The detonators were armed, the timers ticking. Having completed the impossible, Cameron attempted to withdraw, but the submarine was battered, its systems failing. A valve jammed, and the controls froze as the craft rose too quickly toward the surface. X6 broke through the water near the battleship's port bow, surfacing in plain sight of German guards. For a moment, time seemed suspended. Then shouts erupted from the deck above. Machine guns opened fire, spraying the fjord with bullets that ricocheted like sparks on ice. With no chance of escape, Cameron ordered the ballast tanks flooded. The little submarine began to sink again, but the Germans were ready. Depth charges rained down. Each explosion came closer than the last, until the pressure crushed panels and flooded compartments. The crew was forced to surface once more, surrendering to the inevitable. As German sailors approached in motor launches, the men of X6 climbed out, exhausted, drenched, and surrounded by the smell of oil and smoke. Their mission, at least on their side, was complete. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Godfrey Place in XC7 was still beneath the Tirpitz, unaware that his fellow crew had been captured. His submarine had taken a beating from near-miss explosions, and his periscope was shattered beyond repair. He could see nothing. Relying on instinct, Place attempted to back away from the hull, but a sudden shockwave from a German countermeasure jammed his controls. The X-7 lurched forward, colliding with one of the anchor chains holding the Tirpitz in place. The impact twisted the frame, locking them in place like a fly caught in a web. Place tried everything, reversing engines, venting ballast, but the craft would not budge. The only option left was to surface and hope to surrender before the depth charges found them. As X-7 rose toward the light, German sailors spotted the small shadow and opened fire. Place ordered the ballast tanks flooded again, sending the submarine plunging back beneath the surface, but it was too late. The X-7 had been seen. At exactly 8:12 a.m., the fjord erupted. Two enormous explosions tore through the still water, one after another, lifting the Tirpitz bodily off her moorings. A column of water and mud shot 150 feet into the air. The blast ripped open fuel lines, crushed bulkheads, and hurled sailors across decks. Inside the German ship, chaos turned to terror. Power failed instantly. The ship's massive hull groaned as thousands of tons of steel buckled from the concussion. Flames erupted from ruptured pipes, and compartments flooded as water rushed through newly opened seams. For minutes, the Tirpitz listed heavily to port, threatening to capsize. Then slowly she settled back, crippled and silent. When the smoke cleared, the pride of Hitler's navy was no longer a weapon. She was a wounded leviathan, dead in the water. For the British prisoners pulled from X-6 and X-7, the thunder of the explosions reached them even through the walls of captivity. The shockwave rolled through the fjord like a promise kept. They exchanged brief glances. No words, no celebration, just the quiet knowledge that their mission had succeeded. The Germans, still in disbelief, stared at the damaged ship that had been untouchable for so long. Beneath the cold Norwegian sky, the impossible had happened. A handful of men in tiny submarines had struck down the most powerful battleship afloat. As smoke drifted over the water and the fjord fell eerily still again, one fact was unmistakable. The age of giants had just been challenged by the courage of the small. The Tirpitz had survived the blast, but her spirit and her threat had been broken. From this moment onward, she would never again command the seas as she once had. When the echo of the explosions faded and the water stilled, Kåfjord was no longer the same. The Germans scrambled across the shattered decks of the Tirpitz, shouting orders that vanished into the roar of fires and the rush of incoming seawater. The ship's once perfect symmetry was gone. Her hull was ripped open beneath the keel, internal bulkheads twisted and torn. Power systems were crippled, generators smashed, and oil slicks spread across the fjord in dark, glistening swirls. Below decks, over 100 sailors were injured, many scalded by steam or trapped in compartments that had buckled from the blast. In the hours that followed, emergency crews worked feverishly to stabilize the ship. Pumps were engaged to prevent her from capsizing, and divers from the Kriegsmarine's repair units were lowered into the freezing water to assess the damage. Their reports were grim. The Tirpitz's engines, the heart of her movement, were destroyed. The ship would not sail again for months, if ever. News of the attack spread through German naval command like a shockwave of disbelief. The fortress ship, protected by the most advanced defensive network of the Reich, had been struck by what the German High Command mockingly called pocket submarines. For the Kriegsmarine, it was a humiliation that could not be hidden. Admiral Karl Dönitz, Commander-in-Chief of the German Navy, ordered a full investigation, suspecting espionage or sabotage. Yet when the evidence was gathered, fragments of British devices, broken charges, and the captured men themselves, the truth was undeniable. Britain had done the impossible. The mighty Tirpitz had been crippled not by bombers or destroyers, but by 6 men in vessels barely large enough to stand inside. On the British side, confirmation came slowly but triumphantly. Radio intercepts and reconnaissance flights over the following days revealed the truth. The Tirpitz was immobile, listing, and heavily damaged. When the report reached the Admiralty, the news was met with stunned pride. Admiral Max Horten, who had championed the X-Craft program, simply remarked, "They've done it." Prime Minister Winston Churchill, upon hearing the same, ordered that the men involved be honored immediately. In a war often defined by grand battles and vast armies, Operation Source stood out as a victory of intellect and nerve over brute strength. The public, of course, would not learn the details until much later. The operation remained classified for months, but within the Royal Navy the names Cameron, Place, and their crews became legend. For the captured men aboard X-6 and X-7, their triumph came with captivity. After their surrender, they were transported to German prison camps, interrogated, and displayed as proof that Britain had resorted to suicidal machines. Yet even their captors could not conceal a grudging respect. German officers visited them in prison to ask how such small craft had achieved such destruction. The prisoners, bound by secrecy, revealed nothing. Lieutenant Cameron and Lieutenant Place were eventually transferred to camps deeper in Germany, where they would remain until war's end. Prisoners who had already written their names into naval history. Meanwhile, in Norway, the Tirpitz lay silent. For weeks, smoke continued to rise from her deck as crews worked day and night to keep her afloat. Divers labored through icy water to weld steel patches across the torn hull. The repairs were slow and desperate, complicated by the Arctic cold and the constant threat of renewed British attacks. The Germans knew they could not risk moving her. Even if she were seaworthy, Allied submarines prowled the Norwegian coast. So the once proud battleship became a stationary battery, reduced to serving as a floating gun platform against the very bombers she had once been meant to hunt. The damage extended far beyond metal and rivets. Strategically, the Tirpitz's incapacitation changed the shape of the Northern War. Convoys to the Soviet Union resumed with fewer escorts, and the Royal Navy diverted critical resources to other fronts. The German fleet, already outnumbered, now faced an unbridgeable gap in power projection. For Hitler, the attack was a psychological blow. His orders had always been to keep the Tirpitz safe, to preserve her as a deterrent. Now that deterrent was shattered, a symbol of German might brought low not by overwhelming force, but by precision and ingenuity. In every sense, Operation Source was a victory of the small over the great. Yet even in success, it bore the quiet cost of sacrifice. Some of the X-craft never returned. Others were lost in transit, their crews buried beneath the North Sea with no graves but the depths. The men who survived did so knowing how narrow their margin had been, how close courage and death had come to merging in the same breath. The story was not over. Though crippled, the Tirpitz would not yet sink, and her shadow would linger over the Arctic for one final chapter before she met her true end. In the months that followed, the Tirpitz remained trapped in her Norwegian cage, a crippled colossus that could no longer prowl the sea. The damage inflicted by the X-craft was catastrophic. Her engines shattered beyond repair, her steering systems wrecked, and her hull permanently weakened. German engineers worked relentlessly through the winter, towing equipment from across the Reich to restore her. Divers toiled in freezing water for hours, their bodies numbed by cold and fatigue, patching gashes along her keel with steel plates. By the spring of 1944, after 6 months of repairs, the Tirpitz could once again float and fire her guns, but she would never again be fully operational. The British had achieved what air raids and torpedoes could not. They had broken the ship's spirit. Strategically, the consequences rippled across Europe. The Arctic convoys, once paralyzed by the Tirpitz's looming presence, resumed steady operations. Ships laden with tanks, aircraft, and munitions streamed toward Murmansk and Archangel with fewer losses. For the Allies, this flow of material support strengthened the Eastern Front and hastened the Soviet advance toward Germany. In London, naval planners reallocated destroyers and cruisers that had been tethered to Arctic escort duty, freeing them for the Mediterranean and the Pacific. Operation Source had effectively redrawn the naval map without a single fleet engagement. What 6 men in miniature submarines accomplished in one night would echo through an entire year of Allied strategy. Inside Germany, however, the blow was both practical and psychological. Hitler's confidence in his navy collapsed. He accused the Kriegsmarine of negligence and cowardice, furious that a child's machine had breached the impregnable defenses of the Tirpitz. In private, Admiral Dönitz admitted that the attack had exposed a fatal weakness, not in armor or steel, but in imagination. The British had thought differently, and that difference had won. To maintain appearances, German propaganda minimized the damage, claiming the Tirpitz would soon return to service. But even as repairs continued, Allied intelligence tracked her every move. The RAF was already planning her final destruction. By September 1944, the Tirpitz had been moved further south to Tromsø to act as a coastal defense battery. Her engines still unreliable and her mobility all but gone. The move only brought her closer to British bombers. On April 3, 1944, in Operation Tungsten, 40 Fleet Air Arm Barracuda dive bombers struck her from the sky, exploiting weaknesses first revealed by the X-craft attack. The ship was damaged again. Flames erupted across her deck, and more than 120 sailors were killed, but she refused to die. It would take 2 more air assaults, including one led by Lancaster bombers carrying 12,000-pound tallboy bombs, to finish what the midget submarines had begun. On November 12, 1944, 3 direct hits from those massive bombs tore through her decks and detonated inside her magazines. Within minutes, the Tirpitz capsized, trapping nearly 1,000 men inside. The German Navy lost its last great battleship. The sea that had once hidden her now became her grave. For Britain, the destruction of the Tirpitz was a long-awaited closure to a campaign that had consumed years, resources, and lives. Yet among naval officers, it was understood that her end began not with bombers or artillery, but with the X-craft, those fragile vessels piloted by men whose names few outside the service ever knew. Their mission had paved the way, crippling the ship long enough for the final strikes to succeed. When the news of the Tirpitz's sinking reached the Admiralty, the victory was bittersweet. The war was turning in the Allies' favor, but those who had initiated her downfall were either dead or still behind barbed wire, unaware that the giant they had wounded had finally fallen. In January 1944, Lieutenant Donald Cameron and Lieutenant Godfrey Place were both awarded the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest military honor. The surviving crew members received distinguished service orders and medals for gallantry. Their recognition came not only for the technical success of Operation Source, but for embodying the quiet courage that defined so many unseen battles of the war. When Cameron and Place returned home after the war's end, they did so without fanfare. There were no parades or speeches, just quiet pride in what had been achieved. The wreck of the Tirpitz remained visible for decades after the war. An immense rusting tomb tilted on its side in the cold waters of Tromsø. Norwegian locals called it the Iron Forest, a reminder of the futility of power when faced with imagination and will. In time, salvage crews dismantled her piece by piece, her steel repurposed for post-war industry. Yet the story of her destruction, from the first silent crawl of the X-craft beneath her hull to the final roar of the RAF's bombs, became one of the most enduring legends in naval history. The war had moved on, but in those frozen fjords of Norway, a truth had been written in steel and salt water. No weapon, however mighty, is beyond the reach of human ingenuity. In the end, the story of the Tirpitz is not merely about ships or steel. It is about imagination defying logic and courage redefining scale. The British midget submarines that crept through the cold fjords of Norway were not marvels of technology by modern standards. They were fragile, leaky, and crude by design. Yet in their simplicity lay something profound, the triumph of human will over mechanical might. Operation Source remains one of those rare moments in warfare when invention became a weapon sharper than any gun, and endurance became the armor that no enemy could penetrate. It was proof that wars are not always won by those who have the most power, but by those who can think differently when power seems useless. For the men who went into that darkness, victory was never certain, nor was survival. They faced the sea not as conquerors but as craftsmen of risk, trusting in their machines and in each other. Their success was not loud or glorious. It was quiet, disciplined, and invisible until the moment the world shook with the explosion that crippled Germany's pride. That moment spoke to something deeper than strategy. It revealed that courage need not roar. Sometimes it hums quietly beneath the waves. The sinking of the Tirpitz months later closed a chapter of naval history, but the spirit of those who first struck her lingered long after. Every submarine, every commando raid, every covert operation that followed owed something to those early pioneers of stealth and sacrifice. In the still waters of Kåfjord, where the echoes of explosions once rolled between the mountains, there remains an invisible monument, not of bronze or stone, but of memory. It belongs to the men who dared to take a toy submarine into the lair of a giant and, through sheer resolve, proved that ingenuity could humble the invincible. In the quiet after the storm, history judged them not by the size of their vessel, but by the measure of their courage. And in that measure, they stood taller than any battleship that ever sailed.